Tremaine, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So let's kick this off as we always do here, just by having you introduce yourself. Who are you and what do you do?
My name is Tremaine Atkinson. My official title is CEO and head distiller of CH Distillery. My unofficial title is head drinker, which I prefer.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, CH Distillery kind of disguises one of the products that we're going to be focusing at least a good chunk of our conversation on here, that product being Jepsons Malort. And I'm super excited that we were put in touch by ADI President Eric Owens because, this product, Malort, looms large in the consciousness of bartenders in particular and the American drinking public in general. So before we dive into all of the bitterness there and all of the awesome stories and lore behind Jepsons Malort, I'm wondering if you might just give us a story of CH Distillery and how you came to be in the position that you are today.
Sure. Well, and the two are certainly linked. So I'll give you the background. I'll give you the sort of longer version. So my dad is a really smart guy. He has a PhD in physics from Stanford University. So there we go. But my dad, by the age of 25, had 3 kids, and he was a professor, and so he was broke. And one of the things that he liked to do was drink beer. And so rather than go to the store in the early 60s and buy beer, it was cheaper to buy a can of malt syrup, some baker's yeast, and throw that together with some water in a plastic garbage can, and you could make beer. So I have a legacy in my family of alcohol production.
Nice.
But anyway, so roll forward to about 1990, and I'm living in San Francisco, graduated from college. I'm getting started in a career in finance, but really mostly interested in, beer and music and all the fun stuff that was going on in San Francisco. So my brother and I were chatting one day, and we're like, there's this picture in the family album, which is of that plastic garbage can with a nice, head on it, and a plastic dinosaur floating in it, which one of the 3 boys had dropped in there. And so we're like, oh, Pop used to make beer. We should try that. And so we went to the homebrew store and we made a stout and actually entered it in a homebrew competition and took 2nd place. And it was just an extract and whatever, but it was like, boom, really eye-opening. So I started really getting into it, and very quickly went to all grain brewing at home and yeast propagation. I had my own yeast lab and all of that stuff. And then I convinced 2 of my buddies to sort of join in on this, and then we started a brewery in about 1991 in San Francisco called North Beach Brewing Company. And our business plan was to deliver the 6 to 5 gallon kegs to to drinkers in the city. Nobody was doing delivery of that. We didn't actually know if it was legal or any of that, but we just went ahead and got started. And we had between the 3 of us who were all working full time doing something else, we scraped together $5,000. And the results were that we made good beer, but we only sold 1 keg to my mom for her book club. And yeah. So so North Beach Brewing Company didn't really last too long. But there it was. It was kind of, they had the idea in the back of my head. So now we'll roll the clock forward. Oh boy, another 20 or so years more. And I moved to Chicago in 1998. So now about almost 25 years ago. And for my career in finance, which was going well. And I kept home brewing, but after about 10 years of living in Chicago, so now 20 years or so in finance, I kind of hit burnout point. And I was really fortunate that I had saved up at that point. I was in my late 40s, enough money to potentially retire. And so I thought about that for a second, and I was like, yeah, what am I going to do? Like play bad golf, for the next
Right.
like 40 years? Yeah, a good day. A bad day of golf is better than a good day of work, right? But probably not for 40 years. And so then I thought, oh, well, I should start a brewery, and because I had more than $5,000, and then I pretty quickly thought, no, there's an awful lot of breweries out there, but this whole like micro distillery thing seems pretty interesting. And so that's when I decided to open CH, which was in 2013. And our original idea was, and it is still a heart, part of the kind of heart and soul of who we are, was to make a real handmade vodka, from scratch, from grain, milled, mash, fermented, distilled, all the way through as a real product. Because I love vodka. I love many, many alcohols, but vodka is like my go-to. And it's also, a bestseller in the liquor industry. So I thought, well, that sounds like a decent business opportunity, something that I like. I'll be passionate about it, and it has some growth potential. And so that's what has been at the core of CH's portfolio since 2013. And I'm still really proud of the fact that we are the best-selling local vodka. We're the only ones who actually make vodka from scratch from Illinois grain. And it's, it's delicious vodka. So we were motoring along with our small distillery in the West Loop, which we pretty quickly outgrew production, because vodka's got volume to it.
Sure.
So we built a big distillery in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago, which is about 2 miles south of downtown. Is nice industrial zoning. And so all of a sudden we've got a 50,000 square foot facility, it's the biggest one in Chicago. And we have some capacity now. Okay, so that's sort of the story. Now CH, meanwhile, so that little original distillery in the West Loop is still there. It has it's primarily a cocktail lounge, although now it's a cocktail lounge in one of the hottest sushi bars in town. The little thing that happened during the pandemic, who knew? But one of the law at that time in the state of Illinois was that if you're a craft distiller and have a tasting room, you can only serve what you make. That has since changed, but for the first 8 years, we lived under that rule. So it gave us amazing motivation to make a whole bunch of different spirits. So we started making gins and rums. Whiskey we stayed away from after making a couple batches of bourbon and that were absolutely horrible, and also like killed our mill because our mill didn't like corn. And but then we very quickly got into making amaros. And all types of sort of, liqueurs. So anyway, so that's all going on. And meanwhile, I pick up a bottle of Malort one day, and that's the next part of the story. So I'll pause there.
Sure. Well, I love that. That's a wonderfully evocative cliffhanger. Just picturing you walking up to a bottle of Malort and picking it up, and then roll commercials. We'll come back to that after the break. Well, I guess what we should do, we'll definitely come back to the CH portfolio because it seems like, that's really important to the story as well. But before we talk about what happened next, once you picked up that bottle of Malort, could you just explain to our listeners, who many of them have tasted Malort in their lives, but there, I'm sure, is still a significant group of people who are tuning in right now who will not know what it tastes like. And I guess, before I let you give your description, I'll give you one that I came across recently because it's been described in many ways. But one that I found online was baby aspirin wrapped in a grapefruit peel, bound with rubber bands, then soaked in well gin. So take us from there. Do you agree, disagree? How do you think it tastes?
Dead on. That's dead on. That's really good. But you could read another one, and I would say that because Malort just means different things to different people, and it's not just a flavor; it also evokes other emotions, which is really fascinating. I have a lot of fun ones, but the one that I usually tell people who haven't had Malort, what's it like? It's like taking a whole grapefruit and taking a big bite out of the whole thing, and all the way down to the flesh, right? So you get some juice, so you get a little bit, that sweetness, and then you get the rind and you get the pith, and it's all sort of like boom, all at once. And what is most characteristic of Malort is its lingering bitter flavor. That's the thing that freaks people out.
Sure.
If they're not ready for it.
It seems like it's aggressive in a number of different ways. So I come to this conversation with a pretty decent background in bitterness. I make cocktail bitters. We use gentian as our primary bittering agent. So I'm very familiar with that intensely bitter, but also a fairly clean style of bitterness. Whereas Malort is a wormwood based bitter, and wormwood comes with its own entire set of flavors and connotations, right? It's obviously very famously used in absinthe, but here in Malort, it seems almost like the apotheosis of wormwood. It is just crazy bitter. And, I wonder if you can talk about this intensity. Maybe we'll get into some of the history, but if you can just speak a moment while we're here on the subject of flavor and talk about what that intensity does. I mean, because it doesn't lend itself automatically when you taste it to cocktails. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, intensity of flavor is really, it's a fascinating subject, and a lot of it has to do with palate development. And I'll give you sort of an example. So as a vodka distiller or a gin distiller, or really any type of distiller, when you're running your stills, the distillate is coming off the still at, if it's vodka, 192 proof, so 96% alcohol. I mean, it's about as high as you can get. And after doing this for a year, right, 6, 9, 12 months, I was able to walk up to the still and just swipe my finger on the stream of distillate and taste it at 190 proof and not have my palate freak out. And it's not the best way to taste, but sometimes if you just need a quick, I don't really want to cut it, I just want to taste it. Now, where did that, and most people probably couldn't do that. And all it is a skill. It's just a skill that you acquire from work. And the thing that is important as a distiller is that you can taste past the alcohol, because the alcohol is the first thing that really attacks your palate. So even now, if we're at, an extreme 190 proof, let's go down to like 100 proof. 100 proof vodka has got a lot of alcohol in it. And that's typically where we taste our vodka coming off the still, is at 50% alcohol. And it takes a little while, I think it's physiologically and I think psychologically, to be able to build your palate up to where you can taste past the alcohol, because you already know what that tastes like. You're looking for everything else. Bitter is in a very similar category to just the physiological and psychological effects of alcohol, maybe even a little bit more on the psychology side. Because bitter, your body is trained, or built, I should say, your body is built to reject bitter things, because that's your body telling you, nope, that's poison. Don't eat those berries. Don't eat those leaves. That's, bitter, bad, right? So there is like a really innate psychology to bitter things that makes people go, no, right? So like anything else, I've long been fascinated with food and beverage, and I love food writers. And there was a guy who was kind of popular in the 90s called Jeffrey Steingarten, and he was really proud of sort of liking everything, but he hated kimchi, and he decided he was going to like kimchi. And or at least he wanted to understand it, and so he just set about and ate all different types of kimchi. And finally, he said after, 6 months or something, it dawned on him that like he trained his body to start liking it and accepting it. And that's what I think a lot of bartenders have already in one way or another been through that training of accepting bitter as something that is it's okay. It as long as it's not poisonous. And it's a really interesting component of flavor. But if all you can taste is the bitter, then you sort of miss the rest of the party, Anyway, that's a really long answer to your question, which is but it sort of gets at the heart of Malort, because Malort, I don't know if it's the most bitter, spirit out there, but it certainly is way up there. And it doesn't have a ton of other flavors sort of masking that. I've got an Amaro that I made, 10 years ago that was just like a total bitter bomb, gentian and wormwood and cinchona bark and grapefruit peel and but it's also got chocolate, honey, baking spices. And so you kind of go, whoa, bitter, but like, whoa, it's like biting a chocolate cake, made from dark chocolate. So where Malort is more, actually, this will sound surprising maybe to people who know Malort. Malort is a lot more subtle than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things that I was thinking about as I was preparing for this conversation was the number of contradictions that we might come across. And it seems like this is maybe one of them, right? The fact that this liqueur, this Amaro, is billed and sort of mythologized by bartenders as the most bitter, the most aversive thing that you can come across, bombastic and in your face. And yet I think that really the true heart of Malort, and the reason why people come back to it and why it's such a beloved spirit, both in Chicago and in basically in any place with a strong cocktail and bar program culture, is because it does contain that subtlety. So what is the subtlety? To what does it owe that characteristic?
So the primary flavoring ingredient in Malort in Jepsons Malort is wormwood. Okay. And so the plant itself is like any plant. It sort of grows like what would be an example? Almost like a grass, maybe like a wheat stalk, which is a grass, right? And then, but it's got like some flower. It's got some tiny little flowers on it. And so if you sort of take the piece of wormwood, a stick of wormwood, you've got the little leaves and the very tiny little branches, and those the leaves in particular, not surprisingly, have or the flowers have the floral qualities. They have some really subtle, really nice kind of soft and kind of very alpine type of characteristics. Then as you go further down the plant, closer to the root, as the stalk gets thicker, that's where you start picking up the bitterness. And so that's really what you're getting as the flavor profile in Malort, is all of the different components of a wormwood plant.
Right. And, one of the things that I always think of when I taste something that's bittered with wormwood primarily, as opposed to gentian or, something very gentle like a hops, is that I pick up almost like some metallic notes in there. For whatever reason, to me, it strikes the same parts of my palate that would be struck when it's hard to describe it as anything else than a metallic taste. I don't know if that maps on.
Yeah, and it is really distinct. It's not as it doesn't play as well with others as gentian. Cinchona can be a little polarizing too, but gentian's a really gentian is like, hey, I'm bitter, but come and hang out with me, and I won't really interfere with you otherwise. Whereas wormwood is just like, now I'm my thing. So I'm the party.
Exactly. Well, I'm glad that you actually brought up Wormwood and like the physical plant of it, because as I was doing research on your website, which has a really lovely timeline, we'll certainly link to it in the show notes for this episode, but it's got a really lovely timeline with some historical photos. And at one point in history, Jepsons Malort actually came with a stock of wormwood in the bottle. Is that correct?
Yeah, it did actually. We have one of those bottles from we think it's from probably about the 1970s, and actually that is something that it's going to be our 90th anniversary next year, 2023, and so we're looking at bringing that back in sort of a limited edition, having that sprig of wormwood now. And we've experimented with it, and we're pretty sure that the sprig of wormwood that went into those bottles was one that had already been extracted. And I can talk more about what that means, but so is a little more decoration than necessarily additive to the flavor.
Yeah. Well, why don't you, bring us into what that means. And I guess, like you just referenced that Jepsons Malort's about to turn 90. So if in the process you can give us maybe some of the high points in that journey, then feel free to bring us through anything that makes sense and is going to really bring this story to life for our listeners.
Yeah. So really, where does a spirit like Malort come from in the first place? It really just comes from a very long, sort of human tradition of beverages, and particularly alcoholic beverages, being a part of the cuisine, right? And so particularly it seems in more northern climates, that you get a lot of these types of things that are rather extreme in flavor, whether they're bitter or maybe, very strong on herbal. And, we now think of those as aperitifs and digestives, right? Or, there's a lot of different words for it, but that means that they're related to they're part of the way that you consume a meal, right? And so an aperitif is supposed to be something that whets your appetite, and then a digestive is something that helps you with digestion after a large meal, right? And so that to me is really sort of the modern context of spirits of liqueurs in general. But that said, if we roll the clock back much further, when food supplies were much more limited, particularly during the winter in northern climates, you had people had to subsist by eating preserved food, which was mostly food preserved with salt. And it didn't taste, to our modern palates, it wouldn't probably taste that great, or it would certainly be extreme. And so you get something like the Scandinavian culture in Sweden, where you have preserved fish, lutefisk, or all these different things that are pretty crazy. And so if you're eating that, you kind of need something to go with it that is going to A, stand up to it, and B, maybe give you a little offset to that really salty thing. And that's where Malort, which we call it Malort, but it's Basque, that's where it came from. So what Jepsons Malort is a Swedish Basque, which was originally developed to essentially, help you tolerate really extreme tasting preserved fish.
Yeah, that's fascinating because normally when you think of Chicago, the big stereotype from like on the East Coast here is like, oh, you very Polish. Like there's everybody knows that there's a large Polish population in Chicago. But I don't think we necessarily think of Swedish. I mean, it's certainly the Midwest in general has a lot of people of Nordic descent. But can you talk about how, I guess the Swedish connection enters the Chicago picture?
Sure. I mean, there were, a good amount of Northern European immigrants into the Midwest, and the Scandinavians, I think, tended to settle a little bit further north, more like in Minneapolis, in northern Wisconsin. But definitely, there's always been a strong Swedish community in Chicago, and what is now the Andersonville neighborhood. But a gentleman named Carl Jeppson was born in sometime in the late 1880s, and in Ystad, Sweden, which is in the kind of the southernmost part of Sweden, and he immigrated to Chicago, and started a family, and brought this taste of home of Best. So even today, in Sweden and a lot of other places, people, but particularly in Sweden, because alcohol taxes are incredibly high, so it's better to just buy something the cheapest that you can and then add some flavor to it. And so today, as we speak, people are soaking wormwood and other things in what they call snaps, which are just basically kind of grain alcohol, and making their own. So it's no surprise that Carl Jeppson did the same thing in his kitchen when he got here, and it was just something he did at home. And then this crazy little thing called Prohibition happened, and he kind of saw an opportunity, which was that in the Volstead Act, that one of the exceptions was for medicinal purposes, right? And so of course he had friends who were not from Sweden, and they would taste his stuff and say, wow, right? It's very extreme. And so he thought, well, I bet I can sell this as medicine. And so he went door to door. He went around Chicago and sold his Jepsons Malort. And the feds every now and then would, harass him for selling alcohol, and he'd say, here, taste it. And they would try it, and they'd say, well, nobody would drink that recreationally, so you're fine.
It's so funny because we're actually in the process of getting our bitters moved to a co-packer, and so we're going through once again the TTB process, where that it just sounds like you described something straight out of the Prohibition era, and yet our process for getting a bitter, a non-beverage alcohol product, slightly different than Malort, but a non-beverage alcohol product is exactly that to this day, where I need to send a sample to the TTB, and somebody not only needs to approve the formulation on paper, but some person needs to ingest what I sent them and go, like that doesn't taste good. So and it's interesting too. We think of Malort as this, just bottle behind the bar, but it actually shares this like medicinal, I guess, history in common with other iconic ingredients like Angostura bitters, and especially Peychaud's bitters here in the US. Angostura was able to avoid the Prohibition issue by not being in the US, but Antoine de Peychaud, with his cocktail bitters that are iconic to all those amazing New Orleans cocktails, kind of did the same thing. He was, an apothecary / pharmacist down there. And so, it's really interesting to know that Malort shares in that tradition, and certainly a good way to survive Prohibition. So what happened? Go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to say what happened after Prohibition kind of fizzled out. What did the trajectory of Malort look like? Because it seems to me that the middle of the 20th century was really a time when it captured the hearts and minds of certainly the people of Chicago.
Yeah, well, I mean, he this is all mostly folklore, right? But there is some knowledge, because there are some direct sort of descendants of the family. But basically, I'm not sure why, but once Prohibition was over, I think Carl Jeppson thought, oh, this isn't going to work anymore. But there was an enterprising, there were, of course, now distilleries popping up, and one of them in Chicago, which was called Red Horse, or rather DJ Beelzoff. They rated that Red Horse is their brand name, but they were aware of this product and obviously saw some commercial potential and bought the formula from Carl Jeppson and started making it as a commercial product. And that's when it became Jepsons Malort. And it was made here in Chicago, and really, it turned into sort of a hobby for a gentleman named George Brody. George had married into the Bielzoff family and later became, the owner and president of the company. And he sold off all of the other brands because he was actually a lawyer, a very well-educated lawyer, a really interesting guy. And he sold off all of the other products other than Malort because he loved it so much, because the marketing, fun with it, it was so joyful for him. So it really became kind of a business hobby for George Brody. And he had the company all the way from 1945 to when he passed away in 1988. And along the way, his wife had passed away, and he had hired a legal secretary named Pat Gabelick, Patricia. And Pat had, after his wife had died, had become his best friend, and they traveled together, and she took care of him. So when George passed away, he left the company to Patricia in his will. And so and then we ended up, 3 or 4 years ago, buying the company from Pat. So the Chicago legacy is short and tight, or rather long but tight.
Sure. Now, I remember sitting down with Eric Owens, who introduced us, and he was telling me about the fact that Malort, this iconic Chicago brand, was being produced in Chicago once again for the first time in a long while. And I guess, as somebody who also makes bitter things and, who tastes a lot of spirits and works with, a lot of different cocktails, I'm very curious about what the process of not necessarily acquiring Malort was like, because that sounds fairly transactional. You sign some papers, money exchanges hands. But what was it like to take it from where it was being produced by a co-packer and suddenly bringing that back to Chicago and in-housing it? How did that go?
It was a pretty interesting process. I'll just start with a brief thing, which is that there are basically two ways. Well, okay, there are multiple ways to flavor things, but in the world of liqueurs, you either use a natural ingredient or you use a flavor from a flavor house. And there are all types of products that are wonderful that have either or both of those. Now, in our case, being a craft distiller, we've always been really fascinated with ingredients, right? And so all of the products that we've made under the CH line, we're always starting from whole ingredients and getting our flavors that way. Now, sometimes you might distill them like in a gin, but for a liqueur where you don't care about the color, then you can soak it. Basically, you can soak anything in alcohol, right, and extract the flavor out of it. The best example that everybody knows, whether they're aware of it or not, is vanilla extract, right? That's made by taking vanilla beans and soaking them in about 100 proof alcohol. And that alcohol is the solvent. It extracts all those flavors out. And then you have this alcohol, this vanilla flavored alcohol, right? So you can do the same thing with basically any ingredient. And in the case of Malort, that means what we do is we take these big, branches of wormwood and soak them in high proof alcohol, as that's our first step. And that's how we're going to get that liquid wormwood flavor into the final product. All right. So yeah, it was a nice transaction. Patricia is a really wonderful lady. She wanted to retire. She had real love for the tradition of Malort. George was an incredibly important person in her life, and he loved it. So that means she loved it and wanted to take care of his legacy, although she would never drink it. And so I picked up that bottle of Malort in 2013 after I started my distillery and said, why is this made in Florida? And so I tracked down a bartender who worked part-time for Pat as her marketing guy. And I said, what's going on? He said, well, there are no distilleries in Chicago. And I said, well, yes, there are now. And so I said, he said, well, this would be amazing. Let's work and try to bring this, try to get the co-packing business for you guys so that we can bring production back to Chicago. So Sam and I worked on that for 5 years with Pat. I met her a couple of times. She toured our big distillery. And she essentially said, and I said, we'll basically make it for, almost no money. We just want the pride of Malort coming back to Chicago. And she kept turning me down, basically saying, things are going fine. She ran the company from her apartment on Lakeshore Drive with just Sam as her part-time employee, and it was doing just fine. So after about 5 years of bugging her, I gave up. And then about 6 months later, she asked Sam to call me and say basically that she wanted to retire and that she thought I was the right person and that CH was the right distillery to carry on the legacy of the brand. So no pressure, right?
Right,
You buy a Chicago iconic, brand, and now you got to figure out how to make it. So when the deal closed, it closed essentially by email, right? And one of the emails that I got was the formula. And it was just like a PDF of a spreadsheet, that's all it was. And so I kind of had to work from that, to try to figure out how to make Malort. So we took that PDF and we made a batch of Malort based off of it, and it tasted all wrong. And the company that's down in Florida, they were working from the same thing. They had their process of making it, but they didn't really care to share anything with me. But I don't blame them. So we just thought, well, let's just rebuild this from scratch. We know what Malort tastes like, and so we did that. Now, when we bought the company, we bought an inventory of bottled product with it. And which worked out well because we needed some time to make it, so we needed something to sell. So we anticipated that stock that we had would last us about 6 months. Of course, when the news came out that Malort was coming home to Chicago, sales accelerated, and that 6 months of inventory turned into about 3.5. So we were under the gun to figure this thing out, and we probably made 50 different test batches. One of the things that, and this as somebody who makes bitters, very small changes in a recipe can have massive impact, right? And ironically, what happens is, what I've noticed is that the fewer ingredients that you have, and Malort does not have a lot of ingredients, the bigger those small changes have an impact. So we were just dialing around like these tiny little adjustments in sugar level and in alcohol extraction level and flavoring level and all of this stuff. And all of a sudden we're like, well, we got to put a batch out or it's going to run out. And so we put a batch out. And it was our first batch. It was maybe, it was really small, just enough to sort of get things going, maybe, 500 cases. And we invited the top 20 Malort bars in Chicago to the distillery for the grand unveiling of the first Chicago Malort in 50 years or whatever, and we all did a shot together, and we looked at all of our wonderful guests and customers and tradition bearers, and everyone was like, huh, yeah, it tastes really good. And we're like, oh no. What do you mean? And they're like, oh, it's really smooth. And then we all did a second shot, and they were like, yeah, but it's Malort. It's awesome. Good job, you guys. And I was at once very grateful because there were such, lovely people who would tolerate, Malort having changed. But much more than that, I was horrified that we did not meet the mark.
Wow.
And, it's just, you have to always be ready to be humble because, right?
Oh man, as you were telling that story, I was feeling it viscerally. I was like, oh no, what's going to happen? So what does one do when the top 20 Malort bars in Chicago give you that kind of feedback?
You listen is what you do. And they were right. We had, I think, sometimes when you're bogged down in a project and then all of a sudden you're also under time pressure, it's not an excuse, just a fact of life, is that you can lose some of your perspective. And I think we lost a little bit of what the target of Malort was and sort of drifted to a place where we thought was right, but it really wasn't. So very quickly we went back to the drawing board. Now, when I say drawing board, this is where, it's the fun of the job, but, it's also, it's where you need some tolerance skills, let's just say, because with pretty much any other spirit that we make, when we're taste testing it, we're sitting with it, we're taking a small sip, we're rolling it across our tongue, we're, really evaluating it, thinking about it, trying to pick up everything. And, we initially did that with Malort, and then we all looked at each other. We said, well, nobody really drinks Malort like that. And let's make sure we're doing shots, because that's the way most people drink it. And that's the ultimate test. So that's the protocol. That is the official protocol here at CH Distillery for a batch of Malort, is to do shots. So you can imagine when you're in the research lab and you are, you've got 6 different variants of Malort, and yeah, it takes a special group of people to be able to do that, which really means just people who like to drink a lot.
Man, there's so many things I'd love to call this episode. Let's make sure we're doing shots. Oh man,
it's our job.
Yeah. So. Okay, so the feedback that you received was that it was a little bit too smooth and that maybe it tasted too good. And I'm certainly not asking you to divulge any of the secret sauce that you don't feel comfortable divulging, but what does one do to take something and I guess make it rougher, less smooth, less palatable? And maybe this might tie into something that I noticed on your site, saying that you get the strongest, most unpalatable wormwood you can. So maybe this ingredient quality attribute is also something worth discussing.
Yeah. So first of all, the recipe or formula for Jepsons Malort is a secret. Now, I'm smiling when I say that because it's really kind of funny. We were able to reverse engineer it pretty easily, and as I think probably most people could. So so we just hold on to that because it's always been a thing about it. If you ask me for the recipe for any of our other products, I'll send it to you. We love transparency and openness. But so what I can tell you is that Malort has, it's got the wormwood extracted into alcohol. It's a liqueur. So by federal definition, that means it has sugar in it. And then it has alcohol in it. Right. And then maybe there's a little bit of other stuff. And, what I will say is everything is purely natural. There are no artificial ingredients, and there are no flavors purchased from a flavor house or anything like that. This is like, we make it at home. We just happen to have a 50,000 square foot distillery as our home.
Sure.
So that said, there aren't a lot of levers to kind of push and tweak. So one, yes, is the source of wormwood. Now, when way back about 5 years ago, Patricia had cultivated a source for wormwood from Northern Europe that was exceptional. And she entered into a contract and bought it. So we've been the beneficiaries of that as our supply. That said, we're starting to outstrip that supply because Malort as a commercial enterprise has grown tremendously in the last couple of years. And so we have a really fun project, which is just find additional sources of really wonderful / awful wormwood. And we're fortunate enough to we found a farm in just outside of Ystad, Sweden, which is where Carl Jeppson was born. And we are talking with them, and we're going to visit them for the Malort harvest in August. And so we're hoping that they're going to become another major supplier of wormwood for us. But it is really important to get, and I don't know why. We've grown wormwood here. We've had guests who've grown it at their home and brought it to our bar. We've bought it from all over domestically. The plant grows just about anywhere, and we basically haven't found anything other than wormwood from Northern Europe that really, really tastes right. And so that's an important part. And then how you extract it at what proof. There are water soluble and alcohol soluble flavors in anything. And so, the more water you have, the more you're going to bring out the water soluble flavors. So that's a factor. We played around with that a lot. And then so once you have that kind of nailed down, then from there, it's really sugar level is probably the single biggest factor in flavor. So by federal definition, a liqueur has to have at least 2.5% sugar by weight. Now, most liqueurs have far more than that. You'd see, it would not be atypical to see in the 20% category or level. And Malort is actually just touching right on that 2.5%. So it's a very low sugar level. But the difference between, let's say, 2.8% and 2.75%, you can taste. And it makes a big impact on the overall flavor. It's crazy to think. That's like taking like a little pinch of sugar and adding it to 100 gallons, and all of a sudden you change the flavor. Those are sort of the big factors in it. And it's also then a question of how much of the wormwood are you using. There's a bunch of other things in there. So I could geek out. But that's one of the things we do here is we geek out on building, as I'm sure you do as a bitters guy.
It's kind of what I was saying. I was like, this sounds a lot like the stuff that I talked to my co-founders about, and just yeah. And the other thing too is that not only does adjusting the sugar in just those tiny incremental ways that you described make such a big difference, but I find that difference is almost definitely amplified by the presence of bitterness. That's why bitter and sweet as two tastes are so intertwined in our consciousness. And I think knowing the 2.5% federal regulation about sugar, and knowing that Jepsons Malort doesn't really go much beyond that, might be a light bulb moment for those folks who are out there wondering what makes Malort so intense, right? Because you're not really using that sugar in the same way as, like, sure, you can take a shot of Campari, for example, and at this point in my life, sipping on Campari straight sounds rather lovely, whereas it might not have the first time I tasted Campari. Right now, yeah, I could certainly do that. I'd prefer it to be on ice, but that's not for a flavor thing. That's more for just like a dilution and texture type of thing. So yeah, I mean, it's great to know all this stuff about Malort, because I think it does have this, kind of big bad wolf reputation. But the things that I'm pulling out from our conversation is that really it's rather simple, really. There's nothing unnatural or scary about it. And I gotta say, going back to some of these contradictions that I was expecting to encounter, one of those other contradictions is I wasn't expecting Malort to have a terroir to it. I wasn't expecting that the source of the wormwood from Northern Europe would necessarily be one of those quality indicators. I thought, when I think Malort, I think cultural terroir. You should be taking this shot in a Chicago style bar, and it should be aversive, and the bartender shouldn't be nice to you. But to actually have like a real natural terroir to it is a really fascinating component to the story. So I wouldn't be able to get away with not bringing up the Malort or the Jepsons whiskey, because this is also an interesting story that Eric Owens and I were speaking about. So can you talk about Jepsons whiskey, the product that you launched there?
Yes. And while I'm getting my brain ready for that, I'm going to pour myself actually a little shot of Malort, because
my goodness.
If we're talking about doing something else with the Jepsons name, I have to do a penalty shot.
Well, hold on 1 second. Hold on. I will go. I don't have Malort with me, but I will go get an Underberg. So at least I can join you in a shot of something bitter. 1 moment.
All right.
We'll interrupt this in the podcast. Okay, we've got our bottle of Underberg here. I can't let you do this alone.
You're a good man.
All right. Cheers to Jepsons Malort.
Woo.
That's the second time I've done a shot of Underberg on this podcast.
This is not the first time I've done a shot of Malort well before noon. It's funny. I talk about it, and I can talk intellectually about it. I can talk about its subtlety and all that. But then you do a shot, and it's like, man, that stuff. Wow, that's got a punch.
Yeah. So tell me about the Jepsons whiskey project.
So I sort of halfway joke. That we decided to just shamelessly exploit the good name of Jepsons for a product line where we had a long history, but it wasn't selling that well. So I mentioned that when we started up CH, we made a few batches of bourbon and that were terrible. And so since our bar needed a good whiskey, we decided instead to just go ahead and purchase barrels from MGP in Indiana, one of the big, private label bourbon producers, makes fabulous whiskey. And so we bought that, and that became CH bourbon. And one of the things we did, because we kind of didn't like it that people were faking that they were making their own whiskey, is we were one of the early ones to just put right on the label, we didn't make this. But it tastes really good. And then we've always been into, and this is really true across the whole product line, and they're really trying to provide good value for the dollar. We and particularly when it came to the bourbon, we're like, well, if we didn't make it, we can't make up some story to, make it sound more valuable than it is. So we sold it at a pretty low cost. It did pretty well, and we sold it at 105 proof. Because we were buying young bourbon, and young bourbon tends to taste better at higher proof. And so it did pretty well with some cocktail business under the CH line, but it never really took off, which was fine. But at some point, we made an investment in a pretty large number of barrels, and we weren't selling them fast enough to be able to take it out at 2.5 or 3 years. And so we now all of a sudden had a bunch of 4 and 5 year old bourbon barrels. And we're like, well, this stuff's pretty good. Maybe we should rethink this. And so that's when we came up with the idea for Jepsons bourbon. And, which is it's a blend. So it depends on, what's tasting good now, but we have at this point, we have a really, really big inventory of MGP from Indiana. We have Green River from Kentucky, and some Dickel from Tennessee. So it will be comprised of those 3 things potentially. And at the same time, since we had purchased the Malort brand, we thought, well, let's see if we put the Jepsons name on it, if it might just capture a little more attention. CH has developed as a really, really great on-premise brand. So bars and restaurants are by far the primary buyers of the product. So it's well known in the Chicago bartending community, but not quite so much in the general public, whereas Jepsons is. And so We launched on not making this up, April 1st, 2020. Back in November of 2019, we thought, oh, that'd be kind of a fun April Fool's joke, and then it wasn't. Then we sort of really forgot about that, right? Everybody was thinking about other stuff, but we went ahead and launched it. And actually, what was kind of hilarious and telling is that when we did announce it on April 1st, people were like, "Oh, this has to be an April Fool's joke."
Sure.
Like, this is what, Malort bourbon, and so that was kind of funny. So now we're about 2 years later, and Jepson's bourbon has way outsold CH bourbon. It is a better bourbon. It's still at a really fair price, but the thing that have discovered, again, always be ready to be humble, is that at first people were like, "Oh, well, that's the Malort bourbon," and we thought, okay, that's cool. That's people are kind of putting the two together, and then we would get, but does it have Malort in it? And we would even get that question. It says right on the label, straight bourbon whiskey.
Sure.
And we would even get bartenders who are like, does it have Malort in it?
Which is,
and we thought it was kind of,
and it's funny because it's a question of like, you don't know which valence that question is being asked, and it's like, oh, does this have Malort in it? Or, ooh, does this have Malort in it? Like they're, kind of with the head nod of like, oh, this could be a thing. That's an interesting little note there.
So I was just reminded of this because I saw one of our little posters for Jepson's bourbon, and it says, it's got a picture of the bottle. It's very lovely. And, and by the way, the label that we chose for Jepson's bourbon, this is important, looks just like the Malort label, just in a different color scheme. Mm-hmm. And so we were really intentional about making it, potentially confusable with Malort. And one of our little marketing slogans was, no, it doesn't have Malort in it. We're not savages. So anyway, roll the clock forward about a year and a half, and sales had gone really nicely, and they were starting to kind of plateau. And we had a lot of discussions with the sales team about that. And what they said was that people were really hesitant because they thought it had Malort in it. And while that was kind of funny at the beginning, we realized that we needed to sort of be able to move on. And so we're actually just in the last stages. In the next month or so, we're not rebranding it. It'll still be Jepson's bourbon, but we completely redid the label so that it doesn't look like a bottle of Malort anymore.
Well, I think
so
that's
there again is the power, a testimony to the power of Malort for good and for bad.
Exactly. I think that's such a fitting saga for something that was launched during the pandemic of like, all right, we're not really in this pandemic situation anymore. We're coming out of it. We need to kind of put things back on track a little bit here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Tremaine, this has been really fun. I really appreciate you spending all this time kind of taking us through not just the history and the lore, but also kind of the nuts and bolts, the science of Malort. What makes it taste in that kind of like iconic bracing way that it does. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners before we wrap up here?
Sure. So as I mentioned, when we bought the brand, a lot of pressure on us, and we also kind of screwed up the first batch a little bit and whatever. And so the first couple of years were really just trying to not make any mistakes, right, with Malort, and really because we really do honor it and we love it. But as we've gotten a little further into the brand, we're allowing ourselves to have some fun with it as well. And so now we've got a whole bunch of variants which are available in some places and not in others, and sometimes just at our own bar in the West Loop. But we have a barrel-aged Malort now. We have a couple of different versions of that. We have shared barrels with breweries. So for example, we have a 312 barrel-aged Malort at our bar right now. We got a mezcal barrel, just a single barrel, and aged Malort in it. It tastes like the weirdest cough syrup of all time. But probably my favorite project that we did was actually during the pandemic. Josh Deeth, who's the founder and owner of Revolution Brewery here in Chicago, one of my favorite breweries, called me up and he said, dude, we've got all these kegs and we're just going to have to dump them. Can you do anything with them? And in addition to making hand sanitizer, which we immediately did, we were like, okay, let's go on a beer rescue mission. So we got 1,400 kegs from Revolution, distilled them into a spirit, and then turned that spirit into Malort, which we call anti-hero Malort. And so yeah, it sort of goes on and on. So I guess that was my little shameless marketing plug. Look out, keep a lookout. Oh, and there's Malort Spritz, which is a canned cocktail, grapefruit soda, hibiscus, lime, and Malort that is made by our great friends at Mars Brewing Company in Bridgeport. And that's just that it's almost like, Malort as for kids. Now, I don't mean that literally for children, but people who are kids at heart.
Sure. Or people who just don't want to volunteer to have their taste buds blasted off, when they're day drinking. Well,
exactly.
I'm really glad that we ended on this note because it seems like the history and the sort of cultural resonance of Malort is one thing, but it seems like you are only picking up momentum and things are only going to get weirder and more wonderful from here. So I will encourage our listeners to check out some of these new projects. In addition to, maybe next time you're on your way through the liquor store, pick up a bottle of that Malort for your home bar and start playing around with it. But Tremaine, this has been super educational for me, and I want to thank you so much for being a guest here on the Modern Bar Cart podcast.
Thank you, Eric. A pleasure to be here.